Hello, good being with you again to my followers, to those who care to watch and listen, and the numbers are growing, I should say. Today we start a two-part series, mini-series, part of the bigger series about the Israeli-Syrian connection. We'll also start today by referring to the fact that the new so-called ruler of Syria, Julani, or as his true name is, Ahmed Shara, is getting more and more international traction, and not least of all from the American administration of President Joe Biden, who was quick to remove him from the list of terror suspects, and they removed the prize of $10 million on his head. And an official American delegation was meeting with him in Damascus on December the 20th. And we understand also that there are preparations for the upcoming visit of the President of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, who is coming to celebrate his so-called victory in Syria. And as we explained before on a couple of occasions, the victory of Turkey may prove to be a Pyrrhic victory that remains to be seen, but I would caution everybody who watches the situation in Syria not to be so sure that the Turks are really the biggest winners of the situation and they are going to, from now on, to be the so-called actual ruler of Syria, more or less like the Iranians used to be until just a few weeks ago. And the last point about the current situation, the immediate situation, is that Israel still maintains a military force in parts of South Syria, and there already are reports about mixed feelings of local population. At least in one village, there was some hostility shot at the Israeli soldiers. Should not surprise anyone. On other villages, mostly the Druze ones, the hospitality was much more favorable toward the Israeli soldiers. And altogether, it brings me to the Israeli connection. I will start from the end and say that I'm not sure that the Israeli interest is really to stay with military forces in South Syria for too long. I would advise the Israelis not to do so, but we'll come to that later. Let's now start by referring to some of the contextual perspectives of the Israeli-Syrian situation. And this is something that I can really refer to from first-hand experience. I had the privilege and the good luck, I should say, of not just being an academic expert on Syria, but also a member of the Israeli delegation for the first ever peace talks between Israel and Syria following the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. And as you should know, the conference broke down from the general plenum to 3 bilateral meetings. One of them was between Israel and a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. The other one was between Israel and Lebanon. And the third one was between Israel and Syria. And the very fact that there was such a meeting between Israel and Syria was in itself one of the greatest achievements of the American initiative to have the Madrid Peace Conference, because it was, as you remember, about 8-9 months after the end of the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, which was an American operation against an Iraqi regime, the regime of Saddam Hussein, and Hafez Assad, the ruler of Syria, as part of the ongoing historic rivalry between the two wings of the Ba'ath Party at that time, the Syrian and the Iraqi Ba'ath parties. He cooperated with the Arab coalition against Saddam, making up in a way for the fact that he was part of the Iranian coalition against the Arab world, including Iraq, during the Iraq-Iran war of 1980 to 1988. But the point was that Syria, the historic enemy of Israel, the bearer of pan-Arabism under the Ba'ath party, Qalbul Ruba, as they say it in Arabic, the heart of Arabism, was ready to come to a peace conference with Israel and to have direct talks with Israel was in itself a great achievement for the American administration. What came out of that? Well, not much, or rather almost nothing, but almost nothing. Look, something very interesting happened, and I will come back earlier to what preceded these talks. So finally we come to meet with the Syrians. There is a room. There are 10 people on each side, 10 Israelis, 10 Syrians. There's a table separating us in the room. But there were only 9 Syrians around the table. The 10th Syrian was sitting behind. And he was the intelligence officer of the Syrian delegation whose job was to make sure that there won't be any kind of interesting, friendly body language signals from the Syrians to the Israelis. And it was part of this situation whereby you meet an enemy after so many years with all the indoctrination, with all the propaganda, with all the hatred, on both sides, I should say. And what happens is, in a totalitarian system like the Syrian, you have to have somebody who would really monitor the other members of their delegation to make sure that they behave nice. And you can imagine that they behaved nice. But something else was interesting. So you might have expected that the Israeli delegation would come out with a list of demands from Syria about, first of all, the need to achieve peace, and then what the ingredients of peace would be. But no, we came out with something else, the Israeli delegation. I can say we, because as I said, I was a member of this delegation. We came out with a demand from the Syrians to release the 4,000 Jews that were still living in Syria. And we even presented them a detailed list with the names of all the Jews that were living in Syria and who they were, and even their occupations. And we said to them, look, according to every international convention and treaty, the Helsinki Treaty and others, you are supposed to have free travel for people who live in your country to leave if they want to leave the country. And you've got to allow those Jews, the remaining of what used to be a much bigger community in the past, to leave Syria. Interestingly enough, the Syrians were totally surprised, unprepared. And the chairman of their delegation, interesting fellow, very polished diplomat by the name of Muaffaq Alaf, Sunni Muslim, apparently a confidant of President Hafez Assad at that time. He immediately said, what are you talking about? Our Syrian Jews are in good shape. And you know, when I lived in Egypt, I know that all the Jews were rich. Also the Jews of Syria like that. There was some kind of a comment with anti-Semitic connotations that in a way surprised us, but not too much, because ahead of the conference, the then defense minister of Syria, Mustafa Atlas, again a long-time confidant of President Assad, another Sunni Muslim, but a veteran member of the Ba'ath Party, published the book that was repeating the blood label against the Jews from Damascus in 1840. You know, and of course we protested that, but the fact of the matter is that the second meeting, after the first meeting, the Syrians came prepared to answer us already about the claim we made about Syrian Jews, and they showed us pictures of a demonstration, of course, spontaneous demonstration that took place in Damascus, led by the then rabbi of Syrian Jews, Rabbi Avraham Hamra, with a banner in Hebrew, our support for our loved, beloved President Hafez al-Assad, and so on and so forth. No, of course, you can imagine that they were forced to do it. How do we know it? I'll tell you. Because in April of 1992, there was the one and only result of these rounds of talk that we had with Syria, because due to American pressure on Hafez al-Assad to show some goodwill, he allowed finally the Jews of Syria to leave on condition they would not go to Israel straight from Syria. They would go to the US, where there already is and was and still is a big Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. And that was a great achievement. And it was a good will signed from the Syrians that was appreciated. But interestingly enough, among those who left was the Rabbi Hamra. And you know what happened. He moved on to Israel later on, and you know what he did when he moved to Israel? He kissed the ground, as Jews do when they come first time to the Holy Land. So obviously, you know, the demonstration that was held in Damascus on behalf of the president Hafez al-Assad was something that was, of course, fake, artificial, and under pressure, duress from the regime. So why these talks with Syria did not really produce any other results? The two simple reasons are that both sides, the Syrians and the Israelis, and I should say also the Israelis, did not really have an intention to achieve any result leading towards peace. From Hafez Assad's perspective, the reason that he went to this conference in the first place was his realistic realization of the changing of the overall strategic environment in the world, and therefore also in the Middle East, as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, its erstwhile great allies. And also the idea that he needed to correct the damage that he caused to himself and his regime by siding with Iran against Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. And for him, the very idea that he went to talks was the sign of goodwill that he wanted to show not to Israel but to the Americans. And that also explains the gesture about the releasing of the Jews. But still he did it. From the Israeli perspective, the idea was that Israel is not ready to make territorial concessions. It was the Likud government under Prime Minister Shamir, my boss at that time, the great man. He didn't want to make territorial concessions to Syria at that time. And there was no question that with a Syrian refusal to refer to the idea of making peace on the one hand, that will end up the conflict, and Israeli refusal to make territorial concessions, the talks were doomed. The talks were doomed. They were to continue later on under the late Yitzhak Rabin government, and after 96, when Bibi Netanyahu first became Prime Minister of Israel, also under him. We'll come to that later on Monday, when we have another chapter, another episode about Syria and Israel. But let me say very, very briefly that it is definitely the case that the very readiness of Syria to enter these talks was in itself a change. And the change has to be seen against the background of the fact that Syria always presented itself as the number one enemy of Israel in the Arab world. The bearer of pan-Arabism, the Ba'ath Party, with all its ideology of pan-Arabism and so on and so forth. So that in itself was a turning point. And sometimes turning points can still be defined as such, even if the results are not immediately felt. More about that we'll see when I come back with another chapter in this series about Syria. But in the meantime, Shabbat Shalom, Jumma Mubarak, and have a great weekend. Thank you, guys.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.